Today, wanted Scott Morrison's missing stimulus. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to the latest post covering finance and product news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today I'm joined again by journalist Tarric Brooker. Hello, Tarric.
G'day, Martin. How are you, mate?
Yeah, pretty good. So it's the year that keeps giving, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that it's become very clear quite quickly that the only certainty this year is going to be uncertainty.
Exactly right. And if you think things are smooth and straightforward and tranquil, you're missing something.
Yeah, exactly. Like so many forecasts, you just got to tear them up and throw them out the window and start all over again.
And I do find it quite amazing that, a lot of the mainstream economists and, of course, still the stock markets pretty much are saying, nothing to see here. Everything's fine. We'll just keep same old. And yet, I think if you look underneath the water and, see where the rocks are, they're rather near the surface.
Absolutely. I mean, you just look at like falling bond yields. You look at all these things going on behind the scenes around the world. There's so many countries. I was going to make a list of all the different countries who were planning or engaging in a stimulus, but I decided spending 90 seconds reading a list was going to be a little bit too much. Yet, here we are. It just seems full steam ahead. Everything's fine.
Yeah, and it's just worth reflecting on the fact that the Fed in the last few months have put an extra $500 billion into the US financial system, right? So their balance sheet is nearly back to where it was before they started deleveraging it. We know that Europe and the Eurozone in particular were basically looking to do more stimulus, and their interest rates are already negative. And we know that here in Australia, the 7-point-something billion surplus was transmuted to a 5 billion surplus when we had MyEFO, which was way back in December before bushfires and before the virus. And it's clear to me that we're not going to make a surplus with what's going on here. And, so the question is, what should be done?
Well, I think at this point, realistically, we need to abandon the surplus. I mean, it was pretty clear that was necessary when the bushfires occurred. But at this point, I just find it quite, frankly, absurd, really, that we're not at least talking about doing a stimulus. Now, I know that a stimulus is something that a lot of people have an issue with because they just go, well, it's just going to be blown on pink bats or school halls or whatever. And that's a very fair point, and I agree with them. But what we need to do is we need to sit down, industry, the public, government, Treasury, RBA, whoever else wants to come, and just work out what's the best way to get the best bang for our buck to protect jobs, to innovate, to basically just recession-proof the economy as much as we can, to save as much as we can, if it does hit the fan, so to speak.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I don't know whether you've been following what the Reserve Bank has been saying, but Phil Lowe's been out for a couple of outings, and one of the first ones, which I think was his speech at the press club, he sort of carefully separated the role of the central bank and what they can do with regard to monetary policy and what the government should be doing with regard to, the other fiscal measures and the investment measures, and was quite clear in terms of, there is a difference, right? Of course, Frydenberg has been basically saying, it's your problem, Mr. Reserve Bank. Come on, Phil Lowe, give us some more. And I think Phil Lowe is saying, well, actually, we're out of smoke pretty much, at 0.75%. So really, it's over to the government. And it seems to me that we've got a doctrinal block insofar that the one thing that they have been hanging their hat on from a political perspective is delivering a surplus. Of course, it was actually declared last year in the budget when it hadn't even arrived, right? So, so they've got this sort of hook. And now, of course, what's happening is that everything is just going against it. So it would seem to me that the first thing to say is, the surplus is clearly not number one. And they sort of admitted that a bit in terms of saying, well, it's not an end in itself, but it's an iconic outcome of good government, right? And then the other side of it is, if in fact surplus, in other words, putting more stimulus into the economy is required, and I think it probably is, then we should have a discussion about the right way to do it. Clearly, infrastructure investment is not going to work because that takes too long. The pipeline is way too long. So if you start investing in infrastructure, it takes 2 or 3 years for that to flow through. So we need something more specific and more immediate. And that then takes you to some way of putting money into the hands of people who can spend it. So you'd think, well, New Start will be an obvious place to start in terms of we know that's way too low relative to where it should be. And then I think the other thing to think about is that the tax handouts and tax refunds, that didn't work because effectively a lot of people who had mortgages decided to pay off the mortgage because things were uncertain. So it shows that there needs to be some careful consideration of how to go about it. But I'm not sure we're even over the point of saying we need to do something yet.
The levers are effectively potentially broken at this point. Normally they pull the rate cut lever. Over time, retail starts to take off. You get the wealth effect. You get all these different things, but that's not working. Normally with tax cuts, you cut taxes. People get their refunds in sort of July, August, September. People get out there and spend, and that's not happening this time. And I think that's really important for the government to examine, because it's all well and good to say, oh, we're going to bring forward the 2023, 2024 tax cuts. But realistically, what's the point of doing that if it's not going to work? And I have a feeling, going by how the Liberals have been talking about things, how the right-wing media talks about things, in my view, I think it's probably going to be a combination of bringing forward the tax cuts and infrastructure spending is going to be the bulk of their inevitable stimulus whenever it does end up coming. But as you say, if the lever is broken and if infrastructure investment is going to take a while to deliver real outcomes, that's not really going to really do anything in the short term that's going to offer a meaningful boost to the economy as we face this series of massive economic unknowns.
Yeah. Well, giving more tax cuts won't necessarily help, I think. And if you look at what's happening in retail, I think retail is a really good bellwether in terms of just how broken things are, right? Because we keep seeing these litanies of failed retail businesses. And this is getting quite serious because it's not just that, the small businesses, a lot of those are falling over, but some of these are well-known chains as well. And we know that the reason is that people are not able to spend, and it's not because they don't want to, it's they've got no money to spend. And that's a combination of flat wages. The latest data came out recently and showed that wages growth is actually tapering back rather than growing. We know that the cost of living are way higher than the CPI number. And interesting, I don't know whether you saw, but there's a bit of a debate going on now as to whether, in fact, you should include the true costs of property in the CPI or not. And the Reserve Bank is still saying no, you shouldn't, but there are other people now saying, well, maybe you should, because that will give you a better indication of what the real costs of living are. But the truth is that the levers that you've got are pretty limited, and as you say, it may well be that there isn't much that can be manipulated unless you go to full helicopter money land, which takes you towards MMT, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's what I find so concerning about the economy at the moment. You look at retail, you look at this spate of retail closures. There's probably been more retail closures in the last 2 months than there has been in 2019.
Yep.
And even the latest labour market data isn't really all that flash. And it really makes me quite concerned, because that's sort of pre-coronavirus. We haven't even started to see any of the impact of that yet. I've got quite a few messages from people who've contacted me with sort of, I don't have any stock, I'm having to cut staff. All these different things are already occurring. And it's really quite concerning that the economy was already profoundly weak as it is. We were effectively in a private sector recession for quite some time. And now this thing is coming along to hit us, and the government just, move along, nothing to see here. There hasn't really been much of a response aside from, like the quarantines and etc. But in terms of an actual meaningful economic response, the Indonesian Prime Minister, or the President, I forget exactly which one, was here recently talking about his stimulus, talking about all these different things. And then Scott Morrison just smugly stands there and talks about rising housing prices.
Well, yes, don't get me started on the only lever that they want to pull, which is get households to borrow ever more despite the very high debt levels. And we've noticed a big rise in terms of the size of new mortgages being written. The first-time buyer mortgages now, on average across Australia, I think last time around were $420,000. That's ridiculous. That's just way too high. And the fact is that you cannot just use the housing price lever, I don't think, not least because we are already maxed out in terms of debt, but also there's a limited number of people who are actually able and willing to engage in that at the moment. And if I look at my household surveys, there are a lot of people who were 3 months ago saying, well, maybe I should consider transacting in the next 12 months. Well, that's now gone backwards. So effectively, there are less people beginning to think about it. And okay, you've got the first-time buyers who are being hooked in at the moment and reeled in thanks to that 95% incentive scheme, limited though it may be. Expect to see that expanded perhaps. But if we really think that an expanded housing sector is a balanced and appropriate response to the economic issues that we're facing, then I am just amazed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's a really important point. Like we're literally betting everything on housing because at the moment, holes is faltering, digging holes in the ground and shipping it off to China isn't really working. You're seeing import volumes of bulk commodities into China basically collapsing at this point. How long that drop is going to last is anyone's guess. And sure, we're going to see a bounce back at some point, probably later in the year. But what happens in the meantime? I mean, like I was reading your analysis of the coronavirus impact on the commodity market and exports and stuff, and the hit is huge.
Yeah. Yeah, and nobody knows how long this is going to go on for, and there's both a supply and a demand question, right? So demand from China looks as though it's easing. The supply, because of course there's plenty of supply now compared with when Vale fell over in Brazil previously. So you have to expect the commodity prices to continue to drop down a little bit. Now I think still a lot of people are saying this is going to be a short, sharp, blip, but then we're going to have it come roaring back. And we'll get big stimulus from China, as they always do, and therefore demand will actually just be displaced through the year rather than actually be lost for good. But if you think about some of the sectors of the economy, like education and tourism, some of that will not be displaced. It will just never happen. Right? Some of the resources may well bounce back, but if in fact the overall economic tempo around the world has eased off, then essentially demand for the products that China might want to produce would also be going down, and therefore that whole rather complex interconnected set of relationships could take a long time to recover. So I'm not sure that we can rely on China to pull the stimulus. I don't know whether you saw it the weekend, but there was an article in one of the state organ publications from China saying this time around we're not going to do a massive stimulus. What we will do is very careful, cautious, and in fact if anything we want to actually have some more austerity because we know that actually doing big stimulus didn't work last time around. So it's not a lay down misère that China's going to stimulate big at all.
No, it's not. And it's an extremely complex scenario at the moment. Like I keep reading these forecasts from all these economists saying, it's going to cost this much of GDP, that much of GDP. But I read these reports and watch these videos with these, prominent epidemiologists, people who research this stuff for a living and have for decades. And I haven't heard a single one of them say that this is going to all be over with soon. No, they all keep saying, it's 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, possibly longer from now until this is all over. And we're seeing these big outbreaks in places like Korea. I think that the number of cases is up 90% in the last 24 hours. These explosions of cases in Japan. And it just doesn't really fit with the narrative of everything's going to be fine, V-shaped recovery. Because even if China has contained it, even if their massive draconian measures of 500 million plus with limited movement is actually contained it, the rest of the world doesn't have that option. The Korea and Japan can't turn around and just quarantine. You can't quarantine Tokyo. It's not going to work. And I think that's a really important point to remember. Okay, let's just hypothetically say that the Chinese are telling the truth. If their data is 100% correct, this virus is still spreading throughout the rest of the world. And that's going to have an impact in and of itself.
No, you're right there. And of course, the latest news is not good. So we know that 2 of the people who came in yesterday from the boat from Japan are now confirmed as actually having the virus, and we know that there are, I think, another 4 that were actually identified as showing symptoms yesterday and are still being tested. So we have more now, up in Darwin than we had previously. But the other really interesting point, I don't know whether you pick this up, but they've started now to understand that this virus is not just being transmitted through coughing and through water droplets, but also through fecal matter as well. And it's more like some of the other types of diseases that they've seen previously. And that whole transmission mode, which is very different to what they thought, could well explain why it is that the Japanese ship had a major issue, simply because they weren't necessarily pulling all the levers right. So in other words, we haven't yet got across the full transmission processes, right? We don't know precisely what the distribution ratio are between the people who might get it versus the people who get it really badly versus the people who might keel over. There are different numbers being quoted, and I still, I'm concerned that the multiplication rates could be a lot higher than people realize, because this is still something which can be, in some cases, quite mild, such that people might not even register that they've actually got anything serious, yet they could be infectious and still pass the thing on. So I think we have to be really cautious about, for example, opening the floodgates and allowing people to traverse more freely from China. And I know there's a lot of pressure on that, and I understand the economic drivers, but I would have thought public health should come first. And I noticed that yesterday when ScoMo was talking, there was this idea of running a little trial where we might allow a few Chinese students in to see whether it actually worked right. I'm thinking, you're kidding. Are you really going to use Australia as a petri dish? I mean, it seems to me to be completely wacky. I mean, I understand the economics, right? But surely what we should be doing is we should be assuming that the international connectivity is going to remain disrupted for an awful long time, and therefore we should be taking measures locally to provide some stimulus into the local economy to be able to actually buttress ourselves against whatever else may be coming down the tracks. And remember, we had a weak economy anyway before this all started, so actually that wouldn't go amiss anyway. So to my mind, just hoping that this is going to be a short, sharp, V-shaped thing and everything's going to be fine is just a bit nuts. And I go back to my point. If you look at, for example, Qantas now saying that they're going to, cancel flights and I think it's 100 and something million off their profit for the next quarter based on that cancellation of flights, they're never going to get those back. So, line after line, we're starting to see the impact. And I'll tell you something else as well. My small and medium enterprise surveys that I run continuously, I'm quite seeing now a lot of people in a lot of different industries now saying their supply chains are broken. They're not getting the stock that they need. They're not being able to actually, meet the orders that they were expecting to meet. So there is already on the ground across Australia significant economic impact. So you put all that together, and just hoping that somehow magically this is going to get a bounce back and we can open all the floodgates and let everybody start traveling again seems to me to be completely unrealistic.
There was an analysis done by the Japanese media about the number of people on the cruise ship who were asymptomatic and not showing any symptoms whatsoever. And the number that they had was roughly a little over 40%. So we are really in a difficult position at the moment because some of these people contracting the virus have been in quarantine for longer than the incubation period. So that's an enormous issue in and of itself. I mean, we're seeing that with people who are diagnosed who are on the cruise ship. It's been longer than 14 days since the initial quarantine aboard, and the people are already being let go in Japan, yet people are still being sick, people are still being tested. So I think that's really quite a substantial challenge, because it's all well and good to go, oh, well, I don't see anyone that's sick, but if 40% of people potentially coming into 40% of the infected potentially coming into the country are not going to be caught, that's going to make the challenge all the harder in the future. And you're right, you're exactly right, because we are so reliant on China that there are all these groups saying we need to open it up now, we need to open it up now. I think it was the Australian Chamber of Commerce saying, we need to look at the towns and cities in China that are being less impacted by the virus and open the floodgates again. And it's just frankly, it's crazy. It's just crazy. We need to be looking at this in a very serious way because it's a major unknown. All the experts are saying we don't know. We don't know. Like, media ask some questions and they say we don't know. All we have is at the moment is speculation about the mortality rate, speculation about how it spreads, the number of asymptomatic cases, and it's really a time for caution, a time for very, very serious caution.
Well, I agree with that. And, Dr. Tedros from the World Health Organization is saying exactly the same. Don't think of this as effectively, we've arrived anywhere. There are still so many unknown unknowns. And I just hope that the drive with regards to economics doesn't get in the way of listening to the clear voices from the medics and their recommendations, because you can't compromise on this stuff, in my view. It's not like over here we've got the medical guys saying don't let anybody in, over here you've got the business community saying let everybody in, and we'll end up somewhere in the middle, right? I mean, that is a completely nutty way to make policy on this thing. It seems to me that we should absolutely swing in terms of, the experts, the people who really know what they're talking about, the medical people are the ones that we should be listening to. And, frankly, then we react and respond to that assumption. And remember that there are some of the highly qualified people in that medical profession who are saying, do you realise that this could easily end up with 1/3 or 2/3 of everybody in the planet being infected a few years down the track if this runs the way that it could well run? And with the sorts of death rates that we're seeing, that could be an extremely worrying and profound observation as to how this could play out. So we've got to be conservative, and we've got to listen to the medical guys. And I'm afraid that the business community has got to understand that business doesn't actually drive everything. Ultimately, there's a broader agenda here we have to think about, which is the long-term, health of the community. And if that has an economic impact, well, then we need some responses from government to deal with some of the economic impacts rather than just actually compromising on the health.
I think it's important that we just need to realise at this point as well that if ScoMo does in the near future end this travel ban, it's a political hand grenade. There are so many people against ending it from across the political spectrum that he would probably do terminal damage to his leadership, because the Liberals are meant to be strong on borders and they're meant to, stop the boats, except that hasn't even happened. They've let boats dock from China within the quarantine period. And that's been allowed to occur under the government's watch. And that's completely insane. And you're absolutely right. We need to be looking at this, and we need to look at it from a very serious perspective and go, okay, what could happen? Yes, there are a lot of uncertainties. Yes, there are a lot of unknowns, but we need to start planning for that right now. Rather than waiting, rather than just doing what the Morrison government normally does, which is not reacting and going off for a holiday to Hawaii, they need to start planning now. And there needs to be something in place, because we only have a limited amount of ammo. Yes, it may be more than what other nations have, but we don't know what's going to transpire overseas in terms of how credit availability is and what's going to occur. I watched your video with John Adams, on the interests of the people. We don't know if something like that could potentially coincide with what's occurring now. So we still need to be frugal with how we spend this stimulus money. So it needs to be well targeted, and it needs to be done in a very careful way that gets the best bang for our buck.
Well, I agree about that. But, my point would be also, Tarric, that if you think about, you mentioned Korea and you mentioned Japan and the Philippines, right? There are 3 countries there that have now got cases, right? So rather than actually shrinking the travel ban, makes you ask the question whether you should actually be extending it into other areas. So, where we've got proven centres of the disease beginning to emerge, then maybe we should be a little bit more conservative in those areas too. And that, I think, illustrates the problem, right? Because we will probably see more cases in other locations. I mean, we know we've got some in Europe, but there's some in the US too. So effectively, we get to the point where the effectiveness of us being able to block this becomes less and less plausible as it continues. So we have a limited window. And then, absolutely right, we should be actually doing stuff now from an economic perspective to buttress the local economy, to be able to actually lay the foundations for what could be a bit of a siege over not just a few weeks, but frankly through most of this year.
That's something that really just needs to be examined. With the skyrocketing number of cases, with the mayor of Daegu in Korea, I apologize to Koreans if I've pronounced that completely incorrectly, but it's a city of 2.5 million people, and he's telling people to not go outside. If that sort of message is already beginning to circulate in Korea, Japan is telling people to avoid crowded public transport. Good luck with that. But if those messages are going around, we need like you say, we need to be reassessing exactly what's happening and what needs to occur in order for Australians to be protected, because it's going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to get worse, unfortunately, and there's no sign of things abating just yet, despite no matter how much Wall Street and the rest of the global markets may want it to.
Yeah. And Tarric, just before we go, I have one other question relating to this. The opposition is being very quiet on this, aren't they, at the moment? Have you noticed?
Oh, I absolutely have. I've just been sitting there looking at things going, why are they not pressing, why isn't Albo pressing Scott Morrison for a stimulus? It just seems like the most obvious thing in the world. Well, I think at this point, one, I'm not sure Labor are really sure what form they want the stimulus to take, and that requires them to take a pretty sort of serious stand on tax cuts and all these different things. And that means
policy.
Yeah, well, exactly. Albo's got his problem with the Otis group, as they're calling themselves, and there's not exactly a lot of policy unity within the Labor Party at the moment, and I think that's really quite a serious problem for them, because if they can't make up their mind about policy, then they can't press Scott Morrison to do something, because then they risk being called hypocrites and they risk the situation completely changing. But I think that's something that really needs to be touched on as well, because Labor need to have that discussion. If it results in a little war or a little battle, that's what needs to happen, because that's what the country needs. The country needs an opposition who's holding the government accountable, who has an alternative ready, because right now the Morrison government isn't providing that.
Yes, and look, I've got this long-term held view that the problem with the opposition in this country is it tries to sort of, find middle ground and find compromise with the government to sort of. So sometimes there are points where you should actually be taking a stand and essentially deliberately differentiating from the other side of politics, rather than actually trying to find some, crass compromise that actually dilutes principles on both sides of the house.
Yeah, well, I think Labor have been a little bit scared off by that. Like they put together this policy for the 2019 election, the franking credits changes, the negative gearing, family trusts, all these different things, and they got burned by it. But I think it was more about the execution than it was about the policies themselves. I mean, it was close enough to suggest that, and it's also the fact that they ran with Shorten, who wasn't exactly the most popular leader in the history of Australian politics. So I think that there's nothing necessarily wrong with attacking any given issue, but it's about how it's framed and how it's done. Although I will say franking credits is probably something better left for when you're in government, because at this point it's a political hand grenade and a half for an opposition.
Yeah, well, there are some things you would avoid. But, I looked to the US and I watched some of that debate yesterday, and I thought that was quite interesting, particularly, Bernie Sanders, who actually seemed to have a very easy run of it yesterday relative to previous. But what I find fascinating is that a relatively, out there set of policies is definitely resonating with a considerable proportion of the population in the US at a time when you've basically got these two multimillionaires fighting it out in the background. I think it's really fascinating.
No, I love US politics. It's like Australian politics, except everything's exaggerated 10 to 100 times.
Yes.
But I think I think something like that in Australia could be quite successful. I think if there was someone who was, charismatic, someone who was able to generate a really good policy narrative, even with the existing media biases that we do see, but just go after slam dunk policy. There are so many different things that the Labor Party could do in this country that are just easy slam dunk things. Say like fixing Medicare, funding healthcare better, closing gaps for the cost of operations, or including dental, or all these various different things that they could do that are really easy slam dunk things that people could go, oh well, I want my kid to have their teeth covered. I want grandma to be able to get the surgery she needs. Just recently, my missus's grandmother was in major serious pain for months as a result of a issue with her hip, and you think in the collective consciousness there's this idea that no, you wouldn't be waiting. It's an emergency, it'd be done really quickly, but it's not. It's months and months and months, and it's painful for these people, and it's something that is even in a place like Sydney is actually still relatively common. And that sort of thing is just such an enormously easy slam dunk change for the opposition to make. But it also requires a rather sizable political commitment that I'm not sure they're currently willing to make until they're sure exactly where all the dollars and cents line up in terms of their future policies.
Well, I think that's right. And of course, the issue there is that while Bernie Sanders is talking about basically running up a bigger deficit, and then the Green Deal, et cetera, as a way of effectively transforming in a rather visionary way, in my view. I may not agree, with the policy, but at least there's a bit of vision there and a bit of a transformational conversation. My suspicion is that Labour will want to remain small target for a long, long time, and doesn't want to do too much of the vision thing.
No, I mean, at this point, it's all tinkering around the edges, realistically. I mean, even things like negative gearing, franking credits, yes, they're relatively major policies by Australian standards, but in relative terms to compared with what's being proposed around the world, they're relatively, sort of small scale changes. And like you say, I think we're going to see more continued small target opposition, because frankly, that's what's been successful. Tony Abbott wrote the book on small target opposition, hit out at everything the opposition the government does, and then just let them crumble over time as the media focuses them down on every mistake they make and use 3-word slogans. And that worked insanely well for him. He got to within a few seats on his first crack, and then he got a massive majority the second time. So for Albo, there's not really a whole lot of incentive to pursue what we're talking about. Yes, it's in the interest of the country. Is it in the interest of them getting into government and then staying in government? And that's a whole other kettle of fish.
Well, there's two parts to what you say, right? The first is being a small target. Well, he's tick on that. But then the second is actually calling the government out firmly and strongly with regard to some of their policy missteps. And I don't see a lot of that. So it'd be interesting to see how this plays out. So, Tarric, I really appreciate your time today. Interesting times. I think the next couple of weeks will probably be quite pivotal in terms of how a lot of different things play out. So perhaps we should catch up again in a couple of weeks and see what happens next.
Yeah, sounds great, mate. I'm looking forward to it.
Appreciate your time today. Take care.
You too, mate.